Grace and peace to you from God our Father. It's like, what, a week and a half, right? Christmas? A week and a half? So what's 15? 10 days? And maybe like me, are you getting Christmas cards? I got a Christmas card. Thank you. I always love Christmas cards, and I always feel a little guilty. Every year, I always say to myself the same thing. This year, I'm going to do the Christmas cards. And every year, this time of year, I start to get Christmas cards, I think, next year. Next year. There's another problem with Christmas. I get Christmas cards from young people. Well, they were young when I knew them, in the congregations I've served. And when I leave a congregation, I sort of lock you in to the age that you are right now. And then lo and behold, a few years later, I get a Christmas card. And it shows them with their spouse and 2 kids. And I think, that can't be, you know. I did get a Christmas card once from my wife. Well, I'm going to tell you, it was on the front, it said, "You are the answer to my dreams. And you are the answer to my prayers." And I thought, finally she got it right. And then you open it up, and it says, "You're not what I was praying for exactly. But I guess you were the answer." I think that was kind of a backhanded slap. Today we have a text that asks that very question. Are you the one we've been praying for? Now, John is in prison. And prison in those days, probably still is, I don't know, but prison in those days was literally a hellhole. It was filthy, dark, disease-ridden. There was no plumbing. And John is in there for one reason. You see, John was preaching throughout the countryside. Now, one of the things he was preaching about was King Herod. Now, King Herod was involved in an affair with his half-niece. And if that's not kind of lucky enough, the half-niece was married to his brother. It's kind of the first century soap opera. And so John is condemning Herod. Well, Herod was okay with that. Now, you remember, Herod is like the Kim Jong-un of the first century, an absolute dictator. If he decides because you looked at him wrong that you lose your head, you lose your head. And he was willing to put up with it for a while until John started attracting crowds. And realizing that John wasn't going to be quiet, threw him in prison. Now, there are people today who talk about what happens when, the church, for instance, gets too cozy with the politics. But that's not what John was doing. John was speaking truth to power, which is the responsibility of the church. Calling those in power to task. And so John hears about this Jesus. He sends his disciples. And they approach Jesus and say, "Are you the one? Or should we wait for another?" Now notice, once again, Jesus never answers the question. Rather, he tells the disciples, "Go tell John what you see. Go tell John what you hear. The blind are given their sight. The lame walk. The dead are raised. The deaf are given their hearing." And then he ends this little piece with, "Let him who has ears hear." Now, have you ever had something, a statement, that gets kind of polluted to where you can't hear it the same way again? I was even kind of smiling as I was reading it, and there's a reason for that. When I was, sort of your age, which was just a few years ago, we had a pastor. His name was Orland Ness. How can I say this? He was kind of odd. Wonderful guy, but a little odd. In fact, not to his face, but behind him, we used to call him Squirrely Orly. And he was cut from kind of that old cloth. Like my mother, very pietistic. In fact, my mother and Orland would get together and they would immediately switch from English to Norwegian. I guess if you gossip in a foreign language, it's not really gossiping. I guess that's the rule. Even though, as a young kid, you could pretty much figure out they were gossiping. But he was very pietistic, and so his preaching tended to be sort of harsh, very, very down at you. You're not good enough. You're not religious enough. You're not. Very negative, very condemning. And so one summer, when I was in high school, at the beginning of the summer, he said, "I'm going to a workshop." And so I was wondering if he could fill in for me. I said, I used to do that. I used to fill in for him. And I said, "Oh, what workshop are you going to?" He said, "I'm going to a preaching workshop." I thought, good for you. Because he was terrible. And so I did the Sunday service that Sunday, and he came back. And the text was from Matthew. And it had that line, because this is what Matthew uses. "Let him who has ears hear." And then from behind the pulpit, he takes up a big poster board with a big ear on it. And I remember looking at it going, that's just gross. And every time he said, "Let him who has ears hear," he pulled that out. And so afterwards I said, where did that come from? Because, this was back in the 60s. He said, "Oh, that's what they told us at the preaching workshop, is we should use visuals." I said, "A big ear? Really? Is that what?" "Well, we are using visuals." I thought, ugh. So now every time I hear that, all I think of is Orly. It's there. It's forever connected. That's all I see is Orland Ness in the pulpit holding up that big ear. Well, yeah. But what that statement really means is pay attention. Just pay attention. And so Jesus then turns his attention away from John's disciples, and he says a line that is, it's odd. Because you sort of go, what is that? He says to the people who are gathered, did you come out here to see a reed shaken in the wind? Now here's where we need to understand the context. Like all dictatorial rulers, and I don't know what the money looks like in North Korea, but I can tell you that a lot of the money in China has Mao's picture on it. Each sort of despot had their own money, and they all had their own symbol on the money. As Caesar had a picture of himself on the money. Well, Herod had a reed, which stood for Herod. That was his symbol, was a reed. And so Jesus says, did you come out here to see a reed shaken in the wind? In other words, did you come out here to hear the words of John condemning Herod? In other words, did you come out here for the entertainment? Is that why you came here? Did you just come out for the entertainment factor? Did you come out to cheer John on because they hated Herod as much as John did? Is that why you're here? That whole idea of, are you here solely for the entertainment? Do you show up because it's a spectacle? Or are you here for some other reason? That question, are you the one? Or should we wait for another? Stands not just before those to whom this is directed, it stands before us. But what Jesus is telling them is, as great as the Messiah is, as great as John the Baptist is, they are the least in the kingdom. And so Jesus says, go and tell what you see and what you hear. Those who are blinded to love loose in our world are suddenly able to see. Those who are paralyzed under the burden of fear and doubt suddenly have their limbs restored. Those who are deaf are for the first time hearing the good news and singing the great hymns. And all of this is happening not because of one lowly Messiah born in a stable. This is happening because God's kingdom is breaking into our world, and that kingdom is reflected through the face of every person here today. Because the kingdom of God is bigger than any one person, any one Messiah. There was an old Hasidic Jew. Hasidic Jews are the most pious of the Jews. You can always identify them because of the clothing. And this man had been faithful for 70 years. Every Passover, he would celebrate the Seder meal. He would leave the door open. He would leave the empty chair there for the prophet Elijah. And every year, the threshold remained uncrossed, the chair remained empty, and finally, toward the end of his life, he went to his rabbi and he said, "Rabbi, I have been faithful for 70 years. I have celebrated the Seder. I have celebrated the 8 days of Passover. I have left the door open. I have left the chair empty. And Elijah has never returned. Well, the rabbi thought for a moment and he said, you know, there is a family that lives just a few doors down from you. They have many children and they are very poor. So poor they can't celebrate the Seder. Next Passover, you must invite them into your house. And at the end of that 8 days of Passover, I can guarantee you Elijah will return. And so the faithful man did as the rabbi asked. He asked the family to join them for the Seder meal. He fed them. He celebrated the 8 days of Passover with them. And at the end, while the door was open, the chair remained empty. And so he returned to the rabbi. He said, Rabbi, I have done everything that you asked. I anticipated that Elijah would come, Elijah, the one who would usher in the Messiah, and yet the chair is empty. And the rabbi reached into his drawer, he took out a mirror, he held it up to the man's face, and he said, Elijah did come. See, you are Elijah. You brought good news to the poor. You are the ones who broke the chains of bondage. You are the one who gave sight to the blind. And now the question is ours. So what Jesus told John's disciples was that, well, I may not be the one you were praying for. I am the Messiah. But don't stop with just me, lest I become the stumbling block. But look for another, and another, and another. And so as we leave this place today, you become Christ to the world. You are the coming of Christ to the world, to your neighbors, to the poor, to the hurting, to the marginalized. You are their Messiah. And so are you the one? Or should we wait for another?